14. It's our lesson for November 25th. We're going to be talking turkey. What are we talking about?
Well, I guess we're talking about that big fowl or that big bird that has feathers and a terribly ugly face, but it tastes a lot like chicken.
Right, everything tastes like chicken, but turkey is particularly native to North America, right? These kinds of turkey that we're talking about, the wild turkey, is symbolic of Thanksgiving in Canada and the United States. They do exist in Europe, but if we're talking about turkey, we're not just talking about birds or eating turkey. What are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about Thanksgiving, which is one of my favorite holidays. And it's when you have a big sit-down meal with your family. It's in the middle of the autumn, so, you can decorate the table with pumpkins and fall flowers and stuff like that. And, well, you pretty much stuff yourself with about as much turkey and trimmings as you can get.
Right. Now, one of the things that we were talking about before was the idea Thanksgiving originally was giving thanks, especially giving thanks to God because you had enough food to eat, you had a good harvest. These days, however, when people celebrate Thanksgiving, and this is a peculiar North American holiday when we think of Thanksgiving, it's usually getting together with family and eating a lot of food.
It's almost like Christmas. In fact, some people like Thanksgiving more than Christmas. They consider it more of a family holiday just because it's not so surrounded with the commercialism that Christmas is now.
Right, and when we think of Thanksgiving, we think of food, we think of pumpkin pie, but the icon, if you like, the symbol of Thanksgiving more than anything else is the turkey, the cooked turkey. So when you're talking turkey, we're talking about Thanksgiving dinner. Now, in the United States, they celebrate this holiday on the fourth Thursday in November. But in Canada, we don't do that, do we?
No, we celebrate Thanksgiving earlier than that, on the second Monday of October, I believe.
Well, the actual official holiday is on the Monday, but a lot of people will get together on the Sunday and celebrate Thanksgiving dinner. But we have it in Canada in October. The Americans have it in November. Essentially, it's the same thing. Originally started out as a holiday to thank God for a bountiful harvest, having enough food to eat. But now, as we said before, it's basically a chance to get together with the family and eat a lot of food.
Well, which is what we North Americans do so well.
And whether you're Canadian or whether you're American or whether you're in Taiwan and you've been learning about Thanksgiving, you've probably heard about how the Americans invented Thanksgiving, how the Plymouth Pilgrims got together and celebrated the first ever Thanksgiving, this uniquely American holiday. And what we're going to find out today is, well, first of all, it's not uniquely American, and certainly the Plymouth Pilgrims didn't invent it.
Well, surprise, surprise, the propaganda surrounding Thanksgiving is not necessarily true.
All right, then. So let's go ahead then and take a look at today's story. This is day 1 of lesson 14, day 1 of Talking Turkey.
On the last Thursday of this month, people all over America will sit down at the dinner table with family and friends to partake of Thanksgiving dinner. Many believe that the idea originated in the 17th century New England colonies. However, the Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Hebrews, Chinese, and even Native Americans celebrated their own form of giving thanks for bountiful harvests long before Americans adopted the practice.
Another reputed fact is that the first Thanksgiving feast were also gestures of goodwill toward American natives. However, according to many Native American historians, this idealistic notion of cultural harmony is far from the truth. What is not reported in U.S. history books, they say, is that Thanksgiving feasts were most often held in celebration of victories over American Indians, such as when whole villages were massacred in the bitter struggle for control of the land.
Thankfully, the bloody side to the holiday is now a thing of the past, and the global meaning of Thanksgiving has prevailed. Today, Americans still celebrate Thanksgiving as their forefathers did, with feasting and drinking. But now they only do so as an act of reverence or to express gratitude for sustenance, family, and friendships, and material bounty.
Well, we're talking about the development of Thanksgiving, but originally the idea of Thanksgiving was to give thanks to the gods, or in case of the English and the Americans and the Canadians, to give thanks to God for a good harvest, for providing enough food to eat, not only for right now, but for the coming year.
That's right. That was definitely a common theme among pretty much every civilization. They believed in a higher power most of the time, and they believed that if they didn't appease the gods or, show the gods their thanks, then the gods wouldn't be as kind the next year, and they would not have as much to eat, and there would be droughts and, that kind of thing.
Now, I can remember when I was growing up in Canada a long, long time ago, it was still pretty much the idea that it was a religious holiday. It was a national holiday, but there was still this idea that you should be giving thanks. A lot of people felt compelled to go to church maybe on the Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend because this was a time when you did give thanks.
Well, I know for a fact that where I live in Canada, around Thanksgiving, they do food drives, canned food drives, and that's when people ask other people in the community to donate canned food or any sort of non-perishable food to families who don't have very much at Thanksgiving. They do this at Christmas as well, but it's just a time for everyone to come together and say, okay, we've all got a lot, let's share it with people who don't.
Right, there seems to be only 2 times a year when people feel really compelled to share and to say, well, we have enough. We should be thankful that we have enough. We should be thankful that we have enough to share and share with those who don't have enough. One of those times is Christmas. The other time is Thanksgiving. So there's a general feeling that there's a fellowship, a community, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go right ahead now and take a look at the story. Now, the first line in our story today says, on the last Thursday of this month, people all over America will sit down at the dinner table with family and friends to partake of Thanksgiving dinner. Now, that's a long sentence, so we're going to break it down. We're going to talk about the last Thursday of this month. Well, usually there are about 4 or 5 Thursdays in any given month. On the last Thursday of the month, and this year it's November 28th, people all over America will sit down at the dinner table. Now, it's interesting because when we talk about America, the term would really generally apply to all of North America, all of South America, including Canada, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Chile. But when people use the word America, what they really mean is the United States. So we're saying people all over the United States will sit down at the table to have dinner.
Mm-hmm. Because people in South America wouldn't be doing this because, of course, they don't have half of what everyone in America does.
And people in Canada, well, we had Thanksgiving a month ago, all right? So they'll sit down at the dinner table, and who are they going to sit down with, Katie?
They're going to sit down with their friends and with their family. It's a time when, if you're away at college or university, then you're going to come home for Thanksgiving. If you're away in the military or if you're just living in other cities, it's just a time when everybody tries to get home and be with their family.
And if you can't be with family, you get together with close friends, with good friends. And when you do that, you partake of Thanksgiving dinner. Now, when you partake of something, it means you participate in it, but also it means, well, in this case, if you partake of dinner, you're eating dinner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's having a share. Everybody's taking their part.
So they're all sitting down together. Maybe there's a big adults table and a small children's table, because I remember when I was younger, all the kids had to eat at one table and all the adults ate at another table. And maybe they drink wine with their dinner and everyone just, talks and catches up with each other. So this is a really big dinner.
Right. So when you're partaking, you're not just eating the same way you would go to the cafeteria or a restaurant. When you partake, it's the idea that it's a formal ceremony or a formal occasion, and everybody is sharing, everybody is taking their part, everybody is eating the Thanksgiving dinner.
Many believe that the idea originated in the 17th century New England colonies. Well, we'll stop there for a second. Now, the New England colonies, this is where the first pilgrims or the first people, the pioneers really, who came and settled in North America. They would have landed in the New England area of the United States, which is actually the states made up of Virginia, Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. So this is where they first would have landed, and they first would have started building their little villages.
Right. These were the colonies on the Atlantic coast of what we now call the United States. Of course, the English had other colonies in that area, all the way up to what we now call Canada in places like Newfoundland and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But many people believe that the idea of what we now call Thanksgiving actually started in these New England colonies in what we call America.
However, the author seems to have found evidence to the contrary, and he says that the Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Hebrews, Chinese, and even Native Americans celebrated their own form of giving thanks for bountiful harvests long before Americans adopted the practice. So the author knows that different civilizations, it was not just the English people who landed in the Americas that began this tradition. This has been going on since ancient times. The Greeks and the Romans, well, those are two very influential and impressive civilizations. They had the gods that they prayed to, as we talked about earlier, and they would have given thanks for bountiful harvests as well.
So what we're saying is that for as long as people have had civilizations, as long as people have been eating, they have had harvests, they have had Thanksgivings for a good harvest.
Right. So the idea of giving thanks for a good harvest, and when we say a bountiful harvest, we mean a harvest that will feed everybody. There's more than enough food to go around. It's a bounty. And this is the kind of thing that we give thanks for, and it certainly wouldn't have been the bright idea of somebody settling in New England.
Right. So we said that this happened long before, a long time before the people in America adopted the practice. We say they adopted the practice. Other people were doing it. They decided to do it too. They've adopted that practice.
That's right. Another reputed fact is that the first Thanksgiving feasts were also gestures of goodwill toward American natives. Now, it's the 17th century, and you have English people sailing over in their boats and landing on this foreign shore, this American shore. Now, the Aboriginal people, the people who have lived there all along, the Native Americans, maybe they would have been a little hostile toward people, coming and settling on their land. This is where we have lived for centuries. Why are you moving in? And why are you just disregarding everything that we want? So communication would have been awkward between them, to say the least. I'm sure they didn't communicate in the same languages. And this is a fact, or a reputed fact, that the reason these feasts were given was kind of a gesture of goodwill, something to say, okay, we're both here, we're both sharing the same land, let's get along, let's live in peace.
Well, it is true, for example, that in New England, in the Plymouth colony, for example, that those people would not have survived their first winter if it hadn't been for the help of the Native Americans in New England. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people believe, and it is true, at least one of those Thanksgiving feasts were saying thank you for your help in getting us through the winter. And as a gesture of goodwill, as a way of saying thanks, to do something to show that we mean good toward you, we are going to share our harvest with you. Let's get together and have a big picnic and celebrate together.
And the Pilgrims really had a lot to thank the Native Americans for, because they were coming from Europe. And in Canada and North America, the winters there can be exceptionally harsh. And if you have never experienced winters like that before, then you don't have a working knowledge of the clothes that you need, the blankets you need, the food that you need to store up for the winter. And the Native Americans, who would have had much more experience, they would have said, look, if you want to live through this winter, you're going to need to adapt very quickly.
Right.
So this is what they were thanking them for. However, according to many Native American historians, this idealistic notion of cultural harmony is far from the truth.
All right, so now we're talking about Native American historians. Historians are people who write about history, tell us what really happened, or their version of what really happened. Now we're talking about Native American historians, also known as American Native historians, or maybe American Indian historians. These are all terms that fall in and out of use, and very often, even in our story today, we'll call them American Natives, Native Americans, or American Indians. Now, sometimes some groups will consider one of these terms or another to be politically incorrect, but all of them get used even by the American Indians, Native Americans, American Natives themselves.
Okay, and according to these historians, the idealistic notion of cultural harmony is far from the truth. They say the way that you've written this history as white people in your history books is far from the truth. You've romanticized it. You've idealized it to be this, really kind cultural event that it really wasn't. There was no cultural harmony. There was animosity. There were massacres. And that's the truth. You just don't want to write the ugly truth in your history books.
Right. And your version of history is idealistic. You would like to believe that it really was that way. This idealistic notion, this idealistic idea of cultures living in harmony is simply not true.
That's right. And that's why it's important that cultures write their own histories. Because when one culture tries to write the history for another culture, there's always a bias, there's always a slant, and that's when the real truth becomes clouded.
Well, the one thing about history is that there's always a bias. Whoever's writing it is writing it from his perspective or her perspective, so there's always a bias. And this is why people who do history know that history isn't really what happened. It's my version of what happened, my interpretation of what happened. So that's why it's important for people to write their own histories. But the truth is, most of the time, history is written by the winners.
What is not reported in U.S. history books, they say, is that Thanksgiving feasts were most often held in celebration of victories over American Indians. Well, we'll pause there for a minute. It says, what is not reported in U.S. history books. So these are history books written by U.S. citizens, most likely white citizens, and they are trying to report what happened in those first years in the 17th century. They're trying to report why Thanksgiving has come about.
Right, and these history books are usually the history books we're talking about that are used in the schools, in the public schools, and in the high schools and the university. And what these history books don't say, what they don't report, what they don't tell you about is what?
Well, they don't tell you that Thanksgiving feasts weren't necessarily goodwill feasts. They were actually celebrations of victories over American Indians. Now, when we have victories in quotation marks, that would be really referring to maybe massacres or expelling them from land, doing things that are really, really terrible to American Indians, and then they would say, okay, we won, let's have a huge feast to celebrate.
Right, so when we were talking about victories, actually, the idea of getting together and having a picnic together, that's an idealistic idea. It did happen, but more often than not, they were fighting each other. There were gunfights. Of course, the English settlers or the American settlers had guns and gunpowder. The American Indians didn't. So very often, more often than not, the settlers would win these fights, and that would be considered a victory, wiping out whole villages, and that's what we talk about.
That's right. We go on to say, such as when whole villages were massacred in the bitter struggle for control of the land. Well, as we said earlier, the settlers or the pilgrims, they land on North America. They want to start their own villages, and they don't really care who that land belongs to, because when they look at it, they say, you know, we've sailed across the ocean. We've been through some really hard times to get here. We'll be damned if somebody is going to tell us we can't build a village on this land. So they pull out their guns, and there are massacres. Now, when you massacre someone, well, what do you mean?
It's a mass slaughter. It's not even a fight. It's you're killing people who can't defend themselves or who are incapable of defending themselves.
Women, children, babies.
The whole population. Now, this actually comes from an English word. This word entered the English language during the Crusades, when the people from Europe, the Christian knights especially from Europe, the kings of Europe, were in Palestine, were in Israel, trying to retake the Holy Land for Christ. There was one particular incident in the city of Acre where there was this whole city that had been taken captive, but they didn't know what to do with them. So rather than deal with a whole city of people that they didn't know what to do with, King Richard III, King Richard the Lionheart of England, said the best way to deal with all these prisoners is to kill the whole lot.
Well, it looks like he passed down some of his genes to these settlers, because this is the way they too dealt with the American Indians or the Native Americans. So they say, when we say they say that this has been omitted from the U.S. history books, who says that? Well, the Native historians, they're the ones saying, well, don't forget that this is how it really went down.
Right. It wasn't cultural harmony. There was a bitter struggle for control of the land. They were fighting each other. A struggle is a fight, and it's an ongoing fight to see who gets control of the land.
Thankfully, the bloody side to the holiday is now a thing of the past, and the global meaning of Thanksgiving has prevailed. Well, we say thankfully the bloody side of the holiday or to the holiday is a thing of the past. Now, if something's a thing of the past, it means that it doesn't really bear any meaning anymore. We don't do it anymore. We don't think of it anymore. It's in the past. It's behind us.
It's something we used to do. It's something that used to happen, but it doesn't happen anymore,
So
right?
thankfully, there are no more massacres of Native Indians or Native Americans. I guess that's what we're trying to say here.
Right. When you talk about the bloody side of something, the violent side of something, when there's killing and bloodletting, That's the bloody side of something.
That's right. So that's a thing that we have left behind us. And the global meaning of Thanksgiving has prevailed. So I guess the idealistic notion surrounding Thanksgiving is the one that has prevailed or dominated or won out. So that's what is globally recognized as being Thanksgiving.
Right. The idea of Thanksgiving around the world is not killing people and then celebrating the massacre. The idea of Thanksgiving has always been, or at least for the large part has been, giving thanks to God for a bountiful harvest, thanking God that we have survived and that we will have enough food to last through the new year.
Today, Americans still celebrate Thanksgiving as their forefathers did, with feasting and drinking. Well, this is the way humans in almost every culture seem to celebrate harmonious or important events, you know. If there's a wedding, there's a feast, there's drinking, there's dancing, there's singing. If there's Christmas, you know, there's same thing there. All these important cultural celebrations, they're all celebrated with feasting and drinking.
Right. A feast is when you have a big meal, a lot of food, a lot of people together for a special or important occasion. So that's what a feast is. And if you eat at that feast, and especially if you eat a lot of food, then you're feasting. And when we say drinking, we don't just mean drinking water or drinking soda pop.
No, we mean drinking the fun stuff like wine or alcohol. And that's when everybody starts getting very sentimental. They start hugging each other. Or if you're unlucky enough to be with the majority of the population, inevitably some family members will start fighting. Christmas and Thanksgiving are very high-stress times in North America because all the family gets together and it's not necessarily a time when everybody gets along all the time.
But what we're saying here is that Americans, the people in the United States of America, it happened in Canada a month earlier, but the Americans celebrate Thanksgiving as their forefathers did. Now, earlier, we've used different terms to talk about the Aboriginal peoples of North America, of the United States. We've talked about American natives, Native Americans, and American Indians. We're talking about forefathers. Now, this is an old word that talks about the fathers who went before. It's a way of talking about our ancestors, but it really just refers to the men. These days, forefathers is not a word that gets used a lot.
Well, that's because the feminist perspective has become an important part of history in the last maybe 10 to 20 years. And not only are the Native Americans saying, hey, you know, there are things about our history that are not included in the books. Women are saying there are many things about the history of women that are not included in the books written about this country's history.
Right.
So now we don't really use forefathers so much.
There are still some people who insist on using the word, and it's okay to use it in a historical sense if you're quoting somebody else. But a better word here is ancestors, to say that the Americans celebrate Thanksgiving the way that their ancestors did.
With feasting and drinking. So things are the same now as they were then. But now they only do so as an act of reverence or to express gratitude for sustenance, family, and friendships and material bounty. So now they only feast and drink as an act of reverence. Now, an act of reverence is when you revere something or you respect or kind of worship almost. So they're doing this as an act of worship or to express gratitude or thanks.
Right, so if you express gratitude, you're grateful, you're thankful for something, and this is a way of expressing your thankfulness. And in this case, usually we're talking about as an act of reverence, thanking God for sustenance. And when you have sustenance, that means you have enough food to eat and keep you alive.
To sustain you, yes. And you also celebrate family and friendships, the things in your life that feed you as well as food, the things that feed you emotionally. These are family and friendships. And, of course, you give thanks for material bounty. Thank you, God, for my new car in the driveway and this nice house and the new jacuzzi. These are things that you give thanks for, too, being lucky.
If you have bounty, that means you have more than enough. And material bounty is you have more than enough of the material things, the things in life that keep you alive and make you comfortable.
But that don't really matter. Anyway, so this is what we're talking about when we're talking turkey.
Well, that's about all the time we have for the story part of the lesson today. Don't go away. We will be back with our sentence of the day after this short break.
sentence for the day.
And our sentence of the day is...
No thanks to you.
Well, this is a bit weird. If you say no thanks to you, it sounds like you're being kind of rude.
Well, if somebody asks you for something, you can say, no, thank you, I don't want a cup of coffee. But the way this is used is it's different. It says, no thanks to you. I could say, well, I cleaned the house, no thanks to you. And that means I cleaned the house, and I don't have you to thank for it because I did all the work myself. You did not help.
Right, or maybe it was a situation where I was actually trying to get in your way. Maybe you managed to save enough money to go on a holiday. And you could say, I saved enough money to go on holiday. No thanks to you, because I was spending all your money.
That's right. Whoa. And a Native American historian might say, the truth about Thanksgiving has finally come out. No thanks to U.S. historians.
Because not only did they fail to report it, they actually tried to suppress that history, right? So they say, now the truth is finally known, no thanks to you.
Exactly.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's program. That's day 1 of Talking Turkey. We hope you enjoyed the program. We hope you can join us tomorrow for part 2 of Talking Turkey. Until then, I'm Stephen.
And my name is Katie.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.